I feel a bit daunted by this because we're not a research organisation. We very much are a commercial laboratory. Can I just, as a straw poll, is there anybody who doesn't know who Eurofins are? Oh, great. Fantastic. But I'll just have a little bit of, oh yes, I'm off the edge as well. I'll just have a little bit of a synopsis because the industry, the business was actually established out of research at Nantes University of using SNF NMR as a technology to look at authenticity of wine and fruit juice. And from that, it's now grown into employing 14,000 people, €1 billion turnover business. We have 180 laboratories worldwide. It's probably the leading food testing laboratory worldwide. And we are very much at the cutting edge of technology and very much applying it in the laboratory for testing purposes. We ended up being the only accredited laboratory in Europe for horse meat, which meant we have been very busy this year. And we have a range of different technologies. We have competence centres that specialise in the application of particular technologies. And this is where we are in Wolverhampton. The origins of Eurofins in the UK was through the acquisition of the ADAS laboratory in Wolverhampton, which is why we ended up being based there. And for any of you that know the old ADAS laboratories, it's now been demolished and turned into houses. And we moved into this brand new purpose-built facility last year. But our heritage still sits with the agricultural sector. We still have an agricultural testing part of the business. We do soils, we do anaerobic digestate outputs, we're doing compost. So we are looking at the recycling element of it back into the food chain. And the scope of what we do here in Wolverhampton is covering microbiology, things like allergens, looking at contaminants, which could be trace metals or it might be mycotoxins, and also basic food chemistry such as nutrition as well. And as I say, the scope of what we actually do does cover agriculture as well as food. And I know exactly where I was on the 15th of January this year. At 11 o'clock at night, when I was just putting down my glass of wine, I got my first phone call saying, how quickly can you do horse meat testing? And from that, we knew that we ended up with something that was probably the most expensive crisis that the industry has had for quite a long time. Why did it have such a big impact? Because it was about brand integrity. It was about big names. It was about Tesco. It was about Findus, brands that you take out the freezer all the time. And all of a sudden, it was brands that we couldn't trust what was actually in it. And I want to look closer at the supply chain. And I thank Jonathan because I'm actually focusing on the fish industry. Because with horse meat and the meat industry, we have a limited number of species that are actually going into the supply chain. With fish, we're talking about 2,500 species. And over the years, we've seen a number of different crises. We had GM, we had Sudan 1. As you say, I had been in the right place at the right time. Dioxins in eggs, generally a big issue in Germany a few years ago. And then we had the E. coli in the sprouting seeds. And then last year, we had over 70 products withdrawn due to allergens, mislabeling claims. And obviously this year, we're still suffering from the horse meat. So what I wanted to look is what was the business's responsibility in traceability. And I looked back at what we actually have to do from a legal requirement. And the legal requirement is to be able to identify who's supplying the product and, if you're a supplier, who you're selling it on to. As a retailer, who you're actually selling it to as a consumer is quite an interesting area there with regard to your loyalty cards and whether they could actually use that for a food safety purpose to actually notify the consumers of a particular issue. But the responsibility is what is called the one back, one forward. You only need to know who you've bought it from and who you're selling it on to. But is that good enough? I use as an example Innocent because as a business now owned by Coca-Cola, They have a very strong ethical responsibility. They have traceability back to their source, back to their suppliers. And in fact, actually, they plough back quite a lot of their charitable profits back into the industries that they're actually supporting. And I think that's a very interesting model for sustainability going forward. And they have control of their supply chain right the way through. It's very much an integrated supply chain. And I want to start off looking at the fish supply chain. This actually comes from a DEFRA report. It's understanding the fish trade from China. And I think, bear with me whether I can try it. Oh, yes. So we're looking at China actually being a major producer of frozen fish. Where's that coming from? Well, 57% of it is coming from Russia. Some of it is coming from Japan, but then some of it they sell back to Japan. And then we also have the route of reprocessors here in Southeast Asia. We've all heard about the shelled prawns that come from the UK that go out there to be processed and come back again. But actually, when you're buying it, going back to our one forward, one back, you're actually buying it from somebody in Rotterdam. And that's actually labelled as being North Atlantic fish. Where has it actually come from? You've got a really, really complex supply chain. And then we overlay over the top of that. How authentic is that fish? What you're talking about here is 57% of the fish going in from Russia is actually non-species specific. What we have coming out of China is actually stuff that's species identified. Question on authenticity there. We have a look at things like veterinary residues. We've talked about the fish farming industry and the intensity of that. Huge amount of veterinary application into that industry to make it sustainable. What happens with the residues? You're not bearing in mind, you don't know where you've actually bought this from. We've talked about PCBs and dioxins. Again, entering into the food chain, being concentrated up in the food chain. And then we have Fukushima. I'm glad I managed to get that out before lunch. That's actually producing radiation into the water supply. Bear in mind, you don't actually know where your fish is coming from. And if you're buying fish like that, that's fine because it's identifiable. It's got little characteristics that tell you it's a flat fish and you can identify the species. When your fish comes like that, it's quite difficult to identify what type of species you're actually purchasing. And in fact, actually from China, what it does is it comes in frozen blocks, about the size of that unit at the front. And what we actually discovered as part of the sampling is that the inside of the block contains a mixture of about 50 different types of cheap fish, and they freeze a layer of species-specific fish on the outside of it. So we learned on the sampling you actually take a core through the middle of the block. But what we're actually using is DNA technology to actually identify the different species of fish. Going back to our horse meat crisis, we were able to tell that there was up to 3 horses that were actually in the burgers. So it wasn't just all coming from one horse. There was a number of different horses we could identify. And from a food industry point of view, we have already a built-in barcode. We've already talked about genetics being used as a tool in development. That's already written into each organism and provides a means of us developing assays that we can use to either look at species-specific or to look at universal tests to be able to give a wider genetic fingerprint. And what we have, again, it's fine if you've got a pure sample, but we end up with things like pizza toppings with pepperoni. And you've got to be able to extract your DNA out of that with a mixture of things like tomato DNA and wheat DNA, and to be able to focus that down to actually identify whether it contains horse. And we have been able to do that. Sometimes you can't get the DNA out, but we're also looking at things like species sequencing. So by using effectively the barcoding that's naturally within the organism, we can actually sequence down to the individual organisms, the individual animal, if required, or at least a grouping, a species. And this is where it potentially could be used within the industry, where you've actually got reference sires going into the food chain, from that the offspring, and actually taking tissue samples at that point and generating a database of the DNA of these animals, so that we have traceability right the way through the supply chain. So is that at the moment we have the cattle passport system, so you have traceability to the abattoir. But once it actually enters into the abattoir, then you've lost your traceability. And you can then take it right the way through to the cuts, through to your pizza topping, and you have the reference database in which you could actually refer it back to. And this can be used using other technologies. We're talking about DNA technology, but the origin of the business is an isotope analysis, and we can use the same type of built databases to actually determine things like breed and also geographical origin. So we can actually tell that our Hereford beef is actually coming from Hereford. So it's that you're not only telling the breed-specific aspect of it, but you're also determining the geographical origin of that animal. And I just want to talk a little bit on analysis and testing. We see a huge amount. My colleagues in Europe can't believe the amount of microbiological testing that goes on in the UK. I would say the majority for a lot of our food producers, quite a lot of their budget on testing is on microbiological, perhaps century testing. So a high volume, very low cost. Again, our costs are the lowest across Europe. And then in the middle of that range, we've got things like allergens, legislation which is driving testing. And we may have labelling requirements, nutritional, allergen, different additives. And then at the higher level, because it's very costly, you've got things like monitoring veterinary residues, heavy metals, pesticide residue analysis, and up at the speciality way, such as dioxins and authenticity. And I think one of the challenges for the industry is actually applying risk assessment and actually looking more critically at testing the risks within the supply chain and actually demonstrating analysis. And I'm shooting myself in the foot really as a food laboratory, but really we should be applying a risk-assessed approach and doing the testing at the appropriate part of the supply chain. And in fact, with the meat species issues, that a huge amount of testing of the end product, in fact, actually the testing should be carried on back at the origin of the material. And applying that risk-orientated testing strategy would be beneficial for the industry overall. Eurofins in Europe are involved in a European project, which is the lab on the chip. Well, I'm pleased to say I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime, so I'm fairly safe, I think, in the role that I do at the moment. But this is where the technology is going to. A chip where your DNA technology is applied to a chip, which is then associated smartphone. You can then walk around your supermarket and check your origin of the beef through that type of technology, potentially in the future. And we work with our colleagues at Muddy Boots Software. One of the limitations for this has also been, well, there's too much data. We couldn't manage to capture the data. My colleagues in food processing industry have always said to me, we can't capture all the information about the ingredients we supply, to all the testing that we do, and integrate it totally because the systems would be too big. But cloud technology means that we can actually now relate the databases, we can relate the information, and we can look at the testing being carried out at the appropriate part of the supply chain and it carrying on along with the product and part of the transaction, because it's where that commercial transfer of money happens that the traceability of your lot, of your batch carries on. So there's a lot of potential, I think, with where we're going to go with this in the future. Information technology, informatics is continuing to offer benefits to the industry that I don't think we've fully grasped yet. So has the industry learned from the horse meat scandal? No. I see a couple of faces right in the room. I think my concern is, we talked about the commercial pressures, organic produce. I know my other half, at the height of the horse meat crisis, we went to the butcher for the first few weeks until he thought it was too expensive, and we then went back to the supermarket. And that concerns me. I think that we need to have a longer view, a more sustainable view of where our food's coming from. And that goes for the consumer, and I think the consumer has to be educated first, and then it goes back through to our supermarkets, back through to our suppliers. I think there's a lot of emerging technologies. I think the data systems are going to be enhanced. And please, could we have testing at the appropriate level on a risk-assessed basis and not just fire off? I'm very sad that the man from DEFRA seems to have left, because I could have told him about my absolute horror of being Owen Paterson saying that he's not related, I hasten to add, of him actually saying that every meat product in the country would be tested by the end of the week. And I was going, no! Not even with all the lab capacity in the world will we manage that. But again, it's having realistic expectations of where the technology could bring us. Thank you very much for your time. I hope I haven't put you all off your lunch, and just think of what the future could hold for us all.